Take that, Texas. Well, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, all experienced drought conditions this summer. Even in urban and suburban enclaves, we can see it: low creeks, twisted leaves, stressed trees, turning leaves brown too early, and the fall colors muted. This year, the spring wheat harvest was down as much as 40% in the upper Midwest. Hay crops later were damaged at crucial times. The corn and soybeans and sunflowers withered, and farmers are selling off cattle, reducing herds that took years to build. As a farmer myself, I know that drought and flood are parts of life. Still, I know it's tough to watch. Floods can be quite dramatic. I remember standing on the front porch of our farmhouse as a kid, watching a wooden highway bridge turned on its end, floating through the field out front. In severe floods, the entire character of the country can change. The wolves and the foxes and the rabbits and snakes and what we call whoopie cats, those bobcats, are driven out of their usual habitat and come up in the front yard, wandering around in the fields. Those are the things that can't climb trees or don't like to, and so they have to go somewhere. Floods are dramatic. Droughts are slow and painful deaths. Driving down the highways of the Midwest, it's easy to think of those endless green fields as mass entities, but each stalk of clover and every stalk of corn is a living, breathing entity. Henry David Thoreau once wrote, "Corn grows at night." And he was being metaphorical about how revolutions occur before anyone really notices them, but corn does actually grow at night. And you can hear it grow if there's not a whole lot of noise in your particular neighborhood. On my farm at night, you can hear the cars on the nearest highway. It's about 5 miles away. And there aren't that many cars on the highway, so it's quiet out there, in other words. And I love sitting out on our porch in late June and early July, listening to the corn grow. It's a quiet, crunching sound because the stalks are quite literally smashing apart as they try to expand. And each stalk of corn is a living, breathing entity. Another oddity about corn is that it's now been hybridized so that the stalks are very short nowadays, about yay tall. When I was a kid, they were well over 6 feet and more. Well, yeah, factory farming doesn't really need that tall corn, and so science has tried to get rid of it. But here's a kind of interesting thing. The corn nowadays is shorter, but the roots don't know that. They haven't been hybridized. Corn roots still grow down 6 feet and more, even today. In a year with normal rain patterns, that's not all that important. That's why science hasn't worried about it. The plant uses resources, however, that would normally be used to develop seed when there's no water. And so it converts the energy that would be going into making corn into growing those roots down to try to find water. Which means that equals low corn crop yields. And the corn harvest, the estimates are it's going to be somewhere between 30 and 50% lower this year in much of the upper Midwest. Now, why do I spend a lot of thought on corn? Well, because for Midwestern farmers, corn is the base of the pyramid of everything we do. The horses eat the corn, the hogs eat the corn, the chickens eat the corn, and people eat the corn. No, cows are not supposed to eat corn. That's factory farming. We don't do that. But it's a helpless feeling to watch your crops die. When I was young, the chances of a drought occurring on any given year were 1 in 7. 1 year in 7, it was likely that a drought would damage the crop yield. Now, with global climate change, that average is 1 in 3 years. Every year is a different roll of the dice, and as you people who understand math better than I do know, that every year that is reset. So when I was young, it was very likely that you wouldn't get 2 years of drought in a row. Now, it's increasingly likely. Cultivated soil loses moisture very, very quickly. I remember tilled soil turning into white dust. It looked more like flour, and it felt like you were kind of walking on the moon in ankle-deep dust. One of the many damaging things that factory farming has done is to turn those living things, from clover to corn to chickens to cows, into commodities. Mass things for manipulation and speculation and tariff and export. That's a really sad way to see reality. Every stalk of corn is a life. Every chicken killed is a life taken. When we think of these things as some sort of abstract mass entity, we're doing both them and ourselves a huge disservice, and I think we become a little more brutal. I grew up going to the family graveyard where my relatives lay who had killed the natives and stolen the land that we lived on. One of the muskets they employed is still over our fireplace. The brutality of existence has never been a mystery to me and to most farmers, any more than it's a mystery that meat is about killing or that corn displaces trees and flowers and grazing land. It's only that I grew up believing that killing and nurturing are two sides of the same coin. It's the coin that we call survival. It's something I'm going to be exploring in Coffee and Wisdom the next couple of weeks, by the way, is how we Americans really don't have a tragic vision. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, argued that we just don't have a tragic vision of things because we just want to be happy all the time and we want to live in hope. But farming teaches you something quite different. Farming makes me see the minutiae. You know, the Jewish dietary laws work like that. It's easy to think they're a little bit silly, but the laws teach people that God actually cares how you kill your chickens. And God cares if your food has scales or cloven hooves, or even if you have a little grain of yeast in your kitchen. And that's kind of an amazing way to live life, I think, in that kind of minutiae. It doesn't take belief in God to live that way. It just takes noticing. I think that's why I always practice the art of poetry in my life. Poetry is a way of seeing the smallest things and honoring them. And so is painting and photography and music. Now, verses that I grew up knowing by heart from Christian scripture go like this, and it's one of the few places that Christian scripture actually more or less reflects a Jewish understanding. It goes like this, Jesus is speaking, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? But even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore." Forget about crop insurance and costs per bushel and tariffs and exports. It's hard to stand in the dust and watch living things die, whether that blood is red or green. I grew up knowing that everything was on the line all the time in farming. Drought can take the farm away. Flood can take the farm away. Our lives are inextricably tied to the lives and the struggles of all the other living things, including our planet itself. Water is life. Water is death. Water is suffering. Life is in the little things. Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore.
Fear not, indeed, oh my. In the tradition of the Reverend Bill Ware, who marched at Selma, I answered the call for religious leaders to come. On a steaming hot weekend in June of this year, thousands of water protectors and supporters joined indigenous leaders in northern Minnesota to protest the tar sands pipeline known as Enbridge Line 3. We arrived from all across the country. On that Friday, I picked up a passenger at Minneapolis St. Paul Airport from a Jewish environmental group in California. She rode with me up north. The multi-faith contingent of the protest gathered at the camp, at a church camp, for a sustainable dinner on Friday night and a welcome and water ceremony from Winona LaDuke. Unitarian Universalists were well represented among the people from many traditions, including members of this congregation. On Saturday, we attended an all-day training that divided us into sections based on our willingness to be arrested. There was the red group, those folks who intended to get arrested as acts of civil disobedience, the yellow group, who supported them most closely and who might get arrested, and the green group doing less risky kinds of support. We were unlikely to get arrested. The training that day was deep and thorough. I think we all left there well equipped for whatever the next day was to bring. On Sunday, hundreds of folks from many faith traditions gathered near the headwaters of the Mississippi at LaSalle Lake. For a humanist, this brief ceremony was a master class in interpretation. No matter what language they used, of the leaders who were speaking, the faith leaders who were speaking, our common values for respect for the earth, for the water, for all the people, most especially indigenous people and their way of life, for the gifts of life and water. That was deep and clear. As other activists were at the pumping stations, equipment locations of Line 3, they were chaining themselves to the equipment of Enbridge. Our group joined 1,000 or more to march to the bridge where the headwaters of the Mississippi cross Highway 40. Because my leg was not happy that day, I drove the 2+ miles down to the bridge crossing where Native folks were already gathering and drumming. Wearing my collar and stole that has my FUS name badge on it and says First Unitarian Society, I shared a moment there with Jane Fonda. I thanked her for her work, and she did the same for me. And then she saw my badge and said, "Ah, the Unitarians, the good ones." A little tension between what I said before about all of the other progressive faith communities who were there who really have this deep care for the water. Here's the moment that I will remember most. Out of all the speeches, songs, the demands, and pleadings to honor the treaties that the tar sands pipeline violates, this is the moment. We were standing on the bridge over the tiny and clear Mississippi River headwaters on Highway 40 in Clearwater County. Clear water. Just a few yards below the bridge crossing is a proposed crossing of the tar sands pipeline, one of 200 water crossings in northern Minnesota, including the Mississippi twice. The tar sands pipeline crosses water in northern Minnesota over 200 times, including the Mississippi twice. So on the bridge, the highway was blocked off very far away on either end. And it had been chalked with signs calling for President Biden to honor the treaties and stop Line 3. Ojibwe drummers were holding the space, and dragonflies were darting around their heads. The dragonflies were very active all weekend as we watched the road to the east, waiting for the marchers to come. And finally, we saw them far off in the distance, and we heard them. And 1,000+ marchers approached closer and closer to the bridge, led by drummers to join the ones on the bridge. And so there was this cacophony of sound, and the dragonflies swarmed and swarmed. They joined this riot of sound with their frenzied buzzing. It was an incredibly powerful moment for anyone who was present. The power of people coming together with the intention of holding back the destruction of our precious waters and our precious earth. There were speeches. There was a tobacco ceremony in the water. The grandmothers and the leaders of RISE, Resilient Indigenous Sisters Engaging Coalition, sang songs and prayed prayers. Elsewhere, the Red Group was getting arrested. Several Unitarian Universalists spent long hours chained to equipment and long hours in jail. So what about these dragonflies? No accident about the dragonflies and the water. As Dr. Robin Walls-Kimmerer, an Indigenous woman and a biologist, teaches us in Braiding Sweetgrass, it is well for us to understand both intuitive ways of knowing as well as scientific. In almost every part of the world, the dragonfly symbolizes change, transformation, adaptability, and self-realization. The change that's often referred to has its source in mental and emotional maturity and understanding the deeper meaning and connections of life. Here's what biologists know. Dragonflies are important to their environments, both as predators, particularly of mosquitoes, bless them, and as prey to birds and fish. Because these insects require stable oxygen levels and clean water, scientists consider them reliable bioindicators of the health of an ecosystem. So they were there as an indicator of a healthy ecosystem of clear, well-oxygenated water. And I wonder today, and invite you to wonder with me, where will the dragonflies be when, not if, but when, the tar sands pipelines fail? Where will the dragonflies be, and what will they teach us? As corn, as David told us, is an individual being capable of teaching us what we need to know and capable of being in reciprocity with us when we treat the earth well. So too the dragonflies. They call out the health of the situation. So as we watch for clear water, as we work for clean, clear water across the planet, let's watch the dragonflies and see what they have to tell us now. May there be a miracle. See what they have to tell us now and tomorrow.
This Sunday is not only our traditional water celebration, but this weekend also marks the 20th anniversary of the 2001 terrorist attacks. When I first started planning my remarks for today, I wasn't quite sure how to connect 9/11 with the theme of water. Then, Reverend Kelli, ever wise, said, "How about the reflecting pools?" Of course, I knew immediately what she meant. The reflecting pools at the National 9/11 Memorial in New York City. The two square pools are in the footprints where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center once stood. They're surrounded by the names of those who died, carved in stone. There's a mix of calmer water and flowing water, with a cascade down into a void, representing absence and grief. I was reminded of other reflecting pools I've seen, and the one at the Oklahoma City National Memorial came to mind. That one is also beautiful, part of an overall stunning monument, and it's dedicated to victims of domestic terrorism. Such pools are meaningful and thoughtfully designed, but it occurred to me that in a way they're also emblematic of how America sometimes functions. We reflect afterward, after the death, after the terror, after the tragedy. Collectively as a nation, we react often belatedly. Ordinary citizens may have been surprised by the events of 9/11, but government experts had been warning about such a thing for half a decade. Hubris, invincibility, a poo-pooing of the abilities of our enemies. That's how the United States government reacted to the warnings, instead of with reflection and humility and prevention. Richard Clarke, a former White House counterterrorism coordinator, published a memoir in 2004 called Against All Enemies. In it, he writes this: America, alas, seems only to respond well to disasters, to be undistracted by warnings. Our country seems unable to do all that must be done until there has been some awful calamity. Undistracted by warnings. Clarke's quote was included in a new Washington Post essay by Carlos Lozada titled 9/11 Was a Test. And Lozada looks at the many ways that the United States has failed the test. And as we know, the idea that this country responds better to disasters than to warnings, that it waits to do the right thing until after the calamity strikes, applies to so much more than the events of 2001. The dangers of climate change have been known for decades, and now we are responding to multiple major events practically every week. The scientifically proven best ways to end the pandemic have been clear from the start, but were met with rejection. And we are still, with wide disparities, paying a high price. And for at least the past 5 years, the dangers of rising authoritarianism have been abundantly evident in our fragile democracy. A majority of citizens seem not to believe, or at least not to be paying attention. The result now in gerrymandered Texas is misogyny-driven vigilantism and a free-for-all of guns. There is so much frightening and heartbreaking news. Throughout much of human history, it was the supernatural seers, the mystical oracles, who seemed to know the future, who could foretell what was coming. In today's times, that way of predicting the future has been flipped on its head. Now it's those of us in the reality-based community who know what's coming. We have the facts of history to show us how democracies erode from the inside, and how a nation-building war is a contradiction in terms. We have the data to know where the climate is headed. We have the science to predict the course of pandemics. Meanwhile, we are still plagued by magical thinkers who believe that their God alone, without any help from humans of free will somehow protect individuals and America from catastrophe, despite daily evidence to the contrary. American optimism is both our national superpower and our fatal weakness. So, living in this place, in these times, what do we do? What do we do, those of us who are both blessed and cursed, to know what's coming? Those of us who are, in fact, distracted by warnings rooted in facts. What do we do, those of us who know the value of fully, realistically reflecting on future outcomes, as well as the value of building reflecting pools for what already happened? These are not times of easy answers, but here are a few small suggestions. One is that, while it's important not to bury one's head in the sand, it's a good idea not to stare at the harsh, bright light of truth too relentlessly. Our country has a brutal past, a turbulent present, and a daunting future, and you are not a traitor to the truth if you take a break. As all kinds of marginalized people know, it's not only okay, but life-saving to bring rest and joy and laughter to the journey. Focusing on relationships or creativity or a Netflix binge can provide resilience for the long haul. And when you do return to taking in the truth, be sure to take in the positive facts as well, such as all those activists, often led by people of color, doing the good fight in places like Georgia and Texas and the Line 3 area of northern Minnesota. Amid the demoralization, inspiration does still abound. Another strategy is to start small. In the face of huge global problems, few of us on our own have the power to make big change. It's that serenity prayer all over again, changing the things you can. One place to start can be to listen to those local leaders in marginalized communities who are closest to what's needed and who often have manageable tasks that can be of great benefit to individuals and movements. Small actions can help contribute to bigger changes. A related idea for bringing about change is to focus on results and reevaluate the effectiveness of long-time tactics. Some of what worked in the 20th century still works. Getting arrested to get attention and stop things still works. But some of those 20th century habits may have had their day. For example, as much as I love the written word, I would offer that writing a letter to a congressperson across the aisle has never been less likely to change a mind or change a vote. Many progressives, myself included, like to dream of persuasion. Meanwhile, the hardliners on the other side have been conquering by focusing on raw power from the local level up for more than 3 decades. Our resources, stretched thin by so many problems, should be similarly focused on what works today. And we should support our local leaders, like our school boards, who find themselves on the front lines of the war on reality. And of course, I will always suggest community, community, community. We are 1.5 years into this isolating, exasperating pandemic. And we live in a political culture where the enemies of justice want to see us exhausted, divided, and giving up. One antidote, one of the best antidotes, includes connection, collaboration, and allyship. A coming together around shared values, coming together for companionship and support on the journey. As life flows on, reliably and relentlessly, may we navigate these times together. May it be so.